Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World, the podcast that celebrates the remarkable women of the Viking Age. From fierce warriors and powerful queens to wise seers and cunning goddesses, these women left an indelible mark on history. Join authors Johanna Wittenberg and K.S. Barton each month as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Norse women. Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 22, in which Johanna and I are simply sitting down to have a chat with each other. It's December as we record this, and we wanted to take a little breather to just kind of check in with each other about what we've done this year and what we're looking forward to in 2025. So hang out with us as we chat about how we both make a lot of discoveries during our writing process and about how sometimes we have to rein in our research because we want to go places that maybe is going to take too long and have to delve too deeply into something we might not have time for. We also talk about some interesting things that we've learned this year and sources we've discovered. And we even have a chat about Johanna's trip to England, including Stonehenge, and my trip to Japan, where I visited the ruins of a samurai castle, and how when we visit these places, we can feel the history. Plus, we have a little discussion about the Birka garrison and Vikings who traveled east. And finally, Johanna's going to read to us a passage from her book. I'm K.S. Barton, the author of the Norse Family Trilogy, in which a young Viking woman and a Viking warrior are caught in a deadly blood feud between two brothers. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Hello. I'm Johanna Wittenberg, and I'm the author of the Norse Women series, which is the story of a real Viking age queen who lived and ruled alone in the early 800s.
All right. It's good to see you.
Yeah.
We've had some fun this year. We've had some guests and we've done some really interesting topics. So I think it's been a really fun year in terms of the podcast and everything. So what have you been working on this year with your writing?
Well, I released book 6 back in February, and that was The Queen of War. And now I'm working on book 7, and that is due to be released in March. The title of that book is The Irish Harper, which is it's a dual story. There's 2 stories that take place at the same time. And so they're both in the book. It's been an interesting writing experience trying to do that. But I think it's working.
Is this the first time you've ever done a dual point of view, different characters?
No, I've done it quite a few times, but not when they're 2 completely different, different stories. So
that kind of
they're happening simultaneously, but they're not happening even in the same place. So it's been really fun though. It really has.
That's fun. Yeah. I like that. And I like things that are also dual timeline. When like one is in the present and then one is in the past. And I've even toyed with writing something like that. And I always end up, what happens is I get to the contemporary timeline story. And then I'm like, well, I don't really want to write anything that's going on right now.
Right. I
don't want to have people talking on cell phones and texting, and I don't want to have to deal with all that. And I'm always like, oh, but here's what's going on in the past. Then I get all excited and then I come up and I'm like, oh. Okay,
yeah, I think I belong in the past. I belong in the early Viking age. That's where I want to be. I've thought about writing things that were set in different time periods too, and I'm like, no, I don't want to leave the Viking age. Maybe someday I will, but not now.
Yeah, and then if you leave this time period, then you have to do research all over again. Like I think of how much research we've both done in the Viking age, and to just leave that all behind. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. When I was writing my Helgi the Marked books, somebody had suggested like, oh, you should make him go to India or to Persia or something like that. And I said, oh, that would be really cool. But I said, no, because I don't know anything about any of those places I don't know anything about them hardly at all. And certainly not in like the 800s, 900s, or whenever this would be. And I was like, I don't want to put the time and effort into learning about a completely new place, a new culture, new everything. So, yeah.
Well, and I looked into that as well in my first book. And, you know, actually, my editor said, hey, you can't do this. Just stick to, because I got so fascinated by the idea that the Vikings, even in the early ninth century, they did go to Baghdad, they did
Hmm.
go to Persia. And someday I will write Ulf's story because Ulf, the blacksmith, he was enslaved by a Persian sword master, and that's how he became such a wonderful blacksmith, and also how he learned the secrets of forging Wootz steel.
Hmm.
And that was a secret because the Wootz steel was only produced in a certain place in India, and then it was, only people in the Middle East knew how to forge those weapons at that time. And so I got so interested in it
Mm.
and I started researching it and it's like, oh my gosh, I'll never get this book done. So I still do want to write either probably a prequel of some kind about Ulf. And I'm
Mm.
going to do it, but not right now. Because like you
Yeah.
said, it's just so much research, but that culture was so rich and so fascinating. And the idea that the Vikings went there is just,
Hmm.
to me, amazing.
Yeah. 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 Oh, I would love that. I even had one of my characters at the end of my second Helgi the Marked book. It was a side character, a friend of his he'd made in Constantinople. And he kind of feels like he needs to leave that city. He's kind of worn out his welcome. So he decides to head off to Egypt. And
Oh,
I thought I have no idea. I didn't do any research to see if Vikings actually went to Egypt, but I'm thinking he's in Constantinople. They went everywhere from there. That
they
was
did.
like the city of the time. So I'm like, why wouldn't he? But then I didn't follow him there. He's just like they just said goodbye on the docks and at the wharf, and he was heading off to Egypt.
Yeah, sometimes people ask me how many books I have planned in this series, and it's like, I have no idea because I just have endless ideas. I mean,
Hmm.
it's just every time I get like now I'm editing the last version of this book, book 7, and I'm already thinking about book
Hmm.
8. So I mean, it's writing itself in my mind already, and oh my goodness.
Yeah,
I can't
yeah. It's
wait to
like
get to it.
right? It's like the more you write and think and do research and think about things, the more ideas you have. It's constant. Yeah.
It is.
We can't.
And I always kind of get in a slump about the middle of the book or somewhere in the
Hmm.
middle of the book. And I kind of get into like not writer's block exactly, but I just get in a slump where I'm not moving forward and that's when sit down and start doing more research about the time and place and I always get ideas and that's how I break
Mm-hmm.
through that. I mean, it always happens to me every time, but that's how I break
Yeah.
through that barrier is I just do more research and that fires my imagination and they're finding out new things all the time.
Hmm. Whenever I get stuck, I always get stuck in certain places, and it's the same. Now that I've written enough books, I recognize my pattern. I always get stuck. Well, the writers will know, like, most people know about like a three-act structure. And if you're thinking about it in three acts, I always get stuck about the end of Act 1 as we get into Act 2, because things kind of change. And then I get stuck about halfway. And then I get stuck about like at the end of Act 2 and into Act 3. And it happens every time. And one of the ways I get unstuck is there was a woman, Jennifer Lynn Barnes. She's a writer. She writes like YA fantasy or
Mm.
she's also like a neuroscientist, I think, something like that. She's like does science,
Wow.
brain science, and she talked about something called the id list, the ID, like your id, ego, superego, that kind of stuff. Your
Right.
id.
But
It's those
Jungian.
things that you just like absolutely love, the things that just immediately spark your interest. I had an editor friend who called it catnip. Like we all have our catnip.
Catnip for the brain. Yeah.
Yeah, and so sometimes if I get stuck, I even went through and made a list of all those things that like feed my id. And sometimes if I get stuck, I'll think about like, okay, what would be like an idless thing to throw in here, or even like if my character's in a tight spot, what would be an anti-idless thing to do? Like I had a character once, he had to escape from somebody, and I was like, how can I make this really horrible? So I had him get muddy, and then he didn't, it was too cold for him to wash it off. And so he was just had mud just like stuck to him for a long time. And that just makes me cringe. So, I mean, so I sometimes do things like that. Like, okay, what kind of things do I really love? Like maybe
Make
I
it
could,
more visceral.
yeah. So that's, plus, I think understanding your patterns of where you get stuck
Mhm.
and how to get out of that, that helps a lot. And that really only comes with practice.
Exactly. So do you outline or do you write a structure before you start?
Not really.
Yeah, I
No.
can't. I absolutely cannot do it. I have to discover as I go, so that somebody called it discovery writing, and that describes it perfectly. Because otherwise, I would just get bored if I wrote an outline. Oh my God.
Yeah, me too. I kind of have an idea, like maybe what how I want it to end,
Yeah, sometimes I
and
do.
like certain points, especially after I get through that first act. Usually the first act is when I'm really doing a lot of discovery writing. I'm figuring out the
Hmm.
characters and really trying to figure out what I want to say, like the themes and all that kind of say. And I'm not like thinking of themes when I'm writing, but just kind of like, what do I want to say? Why am I even writing this story? That all
Right.
kind of gets discovered in the first act. And then I'll usually be like, okay, if this is what I'm doing, this is who these characters are, what needs to happen to get them to the end. So maybe bullet points, a few bullet points here and there as I'm going. I'll do that to keep track, but I don't write an outline.
I go
Mm-mm.
back at the end and I kind of reverse outline it. So I go once I get the rough draft done, then I go back and I give a really brief summary of all the chapters. And
Hmm.
I used to have to do it more than I do now, but I still do it. And that way, some things will come clear to me that, oh, this should maybe I need to add something, or maybe
Hmm.
I need to rearrange things a little bit, how they happened in different sequences. So that really helps me. And so it's kind of reverse outlining, but it's definitely after the first draft is completely done,
Hmm.
you know.
Yeah, or when we get to, or at least with me, when I get to the end or like towards the end, and I'll something will happen, and then I'll be like, wait a minute, that has to be set up earlier in the
Yes.
story. Like I had something come out of the blue, one of the very last climactic scenes in this most the book I've been working on this year. And then I went, well, that can't just come out of the blue. I need to set that up a little bit somewhere else. So I've got to go back and
Thank
put in.
goodness you can do that.
Yeah, exactly.
This summer I went to the Historical Novel Society conference in the UK, and I got to meet Bernard Cornwell
Oh,
as well as
fun.
Diana Gabaldon. And so, but to meet Bernard Cornwell, the only way I could do it was to get him to, get in the book signing line. So I bought a copy of a book that I already owned and got him to sign it just so I could talk to him. And it was great. And when, he knew that everybody was an author, people were authors there. And so he said, well, I'll give you one piece of advice. And that is when I have Sharp running down an alley and the Frenchmen are after him, and I don't know how to get him out of that situation, then I put a door in the alley. But you have to go back then and put that door in the alley a couple chapters earlier so that your readers don't get mad at you.
Right, exactly, exactly.
And that's exactly right. And it's kind of the beauty of writing because that's what part of the discovery,
Hmm.
something happens and you're like, oh my God, that's so cool. I can't believe that happened. But then you got to, like you said, you got to go back and set it up and make sure that it works. Because some
Right.
of the things that come to me are just crazy ideas, but I like them. That's what I write for that reason.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, like this thing came out of nowhere and I was like, "Oh, this is cool." But yeah, I have to go back at least a couple of times to set it up.
Nobody's going to believe this.
Well, you don't want, as a reader, I don't like it when something's just thrown in out of nowhere. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why is that happening? That's just happening because the plot needed it to happen. And
And
I don't
that's
like
that
that.
Deus Ex.
Deus ex machina.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm glad you can pronounce it because I can't.
The God in the machine.
God in
Uh-huh.
the machine, yes. And so you got to be careful for that. But you can always go back and kind of
Right.
massage your story to make sure it works because those things are always the most fun.
Yeah. I just went back. My local independent movie theater had Jurassic Park, the original Jurassic
Oh,
Park,
wow.
and went to see it on Thanksgiving Day actually, and it was so good.
It
Just
was. It
the
was a great movie.
storytelling was really good, and I was really noticing those setups and the payoffs, like at the beginning when the archaeologist is telling the story of how the velociraptors hunt. And at first, at the beginning, you're thinking, well, why is he taking this time to tell this story? Well, in the end, it all
We
pays
saw, but
off. So it was really, and to me, that's what makes a story satisfying is when you even if you're not paying attention to the setups at the beginning, what you feel it, I think, as a reader or a viewer or whatever, when they're paid off in the end.
yeah, it's that feeling of satisfaction. And
Yeah.
that's the most important thing. And I mean, I've got to get it as a writer with my story too, or I won't write it. I won't want to. And I think maybe that's what causes sometimes my middle slump is that
Mm,
I'm not getting that payoff. And so that's when I have to go back and figure out, okay, so why is this sort of dragging?
mm,
How can I pep it up? And
right.
then
Yeah.
that's when things start happening, it's
Yeah.
really exciting.
And even sometimes I was looking at my most recent book and I had this one thing that I loved in the moment, but then I forgot about it and I let it go. And I thought, okay, do I need to just drop it, cut it out?
Oh,
Do
no,
I
no,
need,
no, don't do that.
well, no, I mean, it might because something else kind of took its place. And
Yeah.
anyway, yeah, like some things that were symbolic. And I thought, okay, now when I go back and I read through it, I'll have to decide, am I going to keep these things or am I going to just cut them out? Because if I keep them, then I have to pay that off at the end. And I didn't do that. I kind of just forgot about
Right,
these
right.
items. And so, yeah. Yeah, I just finished the first draft of this most recent book. It's like a Viking historical fantasy. It's historical fiction fantasy because it's
Oh, yeah.
mostly like your stuff. It's
Yeah.
at least like it mostly takes place in the real Viking world, stuff that they really and truly believed in. But yet to us, there's a lot of fantastical elements in it. So yeah, that's what I've been working on, and so
Sounds great.
yeah, and I have two points of view of a female who they're living in a land that there's a king who has outlawed all worship of any gods except Odin. And she comes across at the very beginning, she comes across some statues of Freya and Freyr a sacred stone circle, and it kind of awakens some things in her that will work out. And then my male main character he is on a revenge quest because
Oh,
someone has killed his family and he won't stop until he finds out who it is. And the two of them come together. So, but
sounds
yeah, I finished the
exciting.
rough draft and then I let it sit for a little while before I go back. And I'm about ready to go back and just read through it from start to finish and just take some notes. Go from there.
Hmm. Do you have anyone beta read your work? Do you
I
work with other
do.
writers?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
have some
that
beta
helps a lot
readers.
too.
I just have to get it to the point where I feel like I can even give it to a beta reader.
Yeah. Well, that's what my writers group is for. We usually trade chapters. There's about around a dozen of us, and we read each other's work on a regular basis. And then once we get our story far enough that it's in a first draft, then we put it up for beta, where we get, like nine to 10 or 12 people reviewing it. It's really helpful because you
It
get
really
people
is.
from all different points of view.
Hmm.
They all write different kinds of things. They're at different levels, men and women both. It's really helpful.
Yeah, it really is. I've been working with one person. She and I met in a writers group, and we have a lot in common personally and writing wise. So she's an ideal reader for me. And she was
Yeah,
also an editor and she was a book coach. And so the two of us have been sending stuff back, and she's been giving me such great feedback. So that's been really helpful.
it's really important. It really
Hmm.
is.
Hmm.
Well, my book 7 is, as I said, it's two stories in one book because they happen simultaneously. And so, in the last book, Osa had to battle King Horik, he attacked Tromoy, and Rangild came to her aid. And also, the Irish harper Cian was also at Osa's side. And at the very end of the book, he asks Osa to return him to Ireland. It's something he wasn't sure he wanted to go back, but he finally decides at the very end of that book, book 6, that he really wants to. So this next book is called The Irish Harper. And so Rangild returns Cian to Ireland. But Cian has some secrets that turn the vow into a perilous journey and
Ooh.
endangers the lives of everyone on it.
Oh, wow. That sounds
Yes.
fun.
Yes. And then, meanwhile, Horrocks' evil sorceress Groa, who we thought died in the fire in the last book, actually survived and she's grown even more powerful.
Ooh. Oh, like Gunleg, how she's burned and then, I love that.
Uh-huh. And she's very angry,
Yeah.
especially with Osa. So she is out for revenge. So
Oof.
those two stories actually take place, even though they're, Rangild's going to Ireland and Osa's still in Tromoy. They take place in different places, but they're happening at the same time. So that was definitely an interesting one to
Yeah,
write,
that sounds
but
fun.
very fun. Lots of surprises for me as well as the
Yeah. Well, one of the things that happens to me sometimes is my characters change along the way. And
reader.
so, yeah, I started out with a simple, I even added like another point of view character. She's a widow who was married very young to a king down in like Ukraine area. And it's unspecified, but it's because it's not important. And she's become really important. And she's part of like, a bit of a resistance movement against this king who has been forbidden all these other gods and goddesses because the people are like, we need to worship Freyr for, good harvests and we need to worship to
Yeah.
these people. And so, yeah, so there's a bit of a resistance happening. It's been fun.
Interesting. Interesting. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah.
And you said this is going to be did you say a trilogy or?
Yeah, this is going to be a trilogy.
Yeah.
Can't seem to get my head past a trilogy. I don't, when we talked with Octavia and she's on what, book 12 or
Yeah.
something, and you're on book 7, and I
You
don't
know, some
know.
series just have a natural ending, and that's good. A trilogy's great. For me, this is, even when I think about writing something different, I don't want to.
Mm,
This is what I want to write. It just comes from within. And so it just, it really depends on
hmm.
the writer, I think.
Yeah, that's true. I like the beginning, middle, end of a
Hmm.
trilogy. It
I
it
do too.
it helps with my own brain, or else I'd go off in 500 different places. So it's like,
Yeah. And I do, believe me.
so have you learned anything like clearly you must have done a lot of research about Ireland in the last couple books. And is there anything new that you've learned this past
Um,
year? Or
well, I learned a lot from our interview with Marianne Moen, the
mm,
head of the university or the Oslo museum. And, her whole podcast, what she was talking about, and also her writings about archaeological bias and the
mm-hmm,
assumptions and omissions about women in history. So I've learned more and more about that, not just in Viking times, but later. And, I started out back before they really had started to talk about some of these things. And
mm,
so, the more traditional belief in women's roles during the Viking Age still held sway when I wrote my first book. But I just couldn't believe it. I could not believe it. And so I kind of went my own way. And what's really interesting is that now more and more research is showing me that my inner gut feeling about women in the Viking Age was actually true.
mm-hmm,
But I'm also finding out more and more, as we found out when we were doing some of our research on Anglo-Saxon women, that
mm.
they weren't the only ones
Right.
that
Yeah.
had an awful lot more power during certain time periods than anyone knew. So I think that, and yes, I've done a lot of work about looking into Ireland and their beliefs and their religion, and also some of the supernatural. I mean, everyone kind of knows about leprechauns and fairies and all that, but who were they? I mean, what
Mm.
were they? And so I'm kind of looking into that more too. I've got several really interesting books about Druids and also
Hmm.
about the beliefs back in the early medieval period in Ireland.
Neat. Hmm.
So how about you?
Yeah, I doing this podcast has really helped a lot. Even if it was
Hmm.
something that I thought I already kind of knew, just doing a deep dive into things for the podcast or to get ready for an interview or something. Like when we did our episode about the four aspects of the Viking soul, I already knew about that, but then I dove in and I looked for everything I could find on that. And that's actually one of the things that inspired this story in this particular character. Her name is even Disa. So
Oh, that's great.
after the Disir. So yeah, and some of the powers people might have and the beliefs they have. And it wasn't new to me, but the depth of it and was just
Yes.
really fun
Yes.
to discover. And now I'm like really into that whole idea.
It is. I mean, it's so fascinating, and there's
Hmm.
some so many really good resources that have, come out in the last 5 years, 6 years, that
Hmm.
information that wasn't available before. So it makes the research very rewarding, I think.
Yeah, and it's just another piece of evidence that the Vikings weren't like us in a lot of
Right.
ways. Obviously, they were human and they had human emotions, but they also believed things that were very different. They really believed that
Very.
your luck could literally run out on you, or that you could pass down something like that, or that you could somehow inhabit the mind of a bear or something. It's just super cool to me
It
to
is.
think
And they
about that.
really, I mean, they believed it with all their hearts and soul. And there were really no skeptics.
I do have a
Everybody.
skeptic in my book.
Okay, well, that's good.
Well, because somebody killed his family, he and his wife did
Um,
everything they were supposed to do. They worshiped the gods, they made offerings, they made sacrifices, and yet it all fell apart. And so he's just angry and bitter and set on revenge. So he's a bit of a skeptic.
with good reason.
Yeah, that's why I thought, well, yeah, it makes sense for him to just he's turning his back on the gods. So,
I can understand that.
yeah. And then I also discovered, have you ever heard of the warden trees? Or they're called Vorder, Vordr.
Oh, you mean the trees that they planted next to their homes?
Yes.
Yes, I have heard
I
of.
hadn't heard about that. I was writing, this is when we were talking about discovering things. I was writing a scene with my two main characters, and they're in this place. It's like a special place to her. And then there's a tree. It's a beautiful tree. I think it's a linden tree. And he touches the trunk of it. And I thought, oh, there needs to be something special about this tree. So I'm like researching how to, Viking tree spirits and things like that. And I'm thinking, do they have like the Greeks with dryads or something like
Right.
that? And I'm looking and looking, and then I came across these warden trees, and I was like, that's perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. So yeah, these guardians that would guard farms, families, or
Hmm.
whatever, and then the people of the family would make offerings or bury things at the base of the tree to protect them. And
One of
yeah.
the researches that I did, and I'm trying to remember the source, but it was in one of my books, my many books. It talked about an ancient tree stump that, the
Mm.
tree had been cut down, probably, possibly during the Christian era, possibly after the family converted to Christianity. But all around the stump, this was a very old tree. It was a huge stump. And all around the stump were the remains of animals that had been
Mm.
sacrificed, including bears.
Wow.
So, yeah, I mean, and I don't know if this was just like one family's tree or if it was a community tree.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
did
it
that
probably
too. Hmm.
was more of a community tree, but that it was so fascinating. I mean, there were just literally dozens of animals that had the remains of them were at the base of this huge, huge tree
Hmm.
that had been cut down. So yeah, it's an amazing, it's very
Yeah,
interesting, really
it is.
fascinating.
Yeah.
And it's hard to understand exactly how they felt that the sacrifice was received, and what
Mm.
did it do? I don't always understand that really well. What did did they think it was just like a transaction?
Right.
Here, have this bear blood and give me success and good crops. Or I mean, I don't know because they
Yeah.
fill the fields with blood of the sacrifice, and of course they have the cart that the Freya, the priestess of Freya would ride around in this cart with an image of Frey beside her. This is something that's documented. And she'd ride around the fields with this blessing, it was
Mm.
part of blessing the crops. And, you know, I I guess that they're just calling attention to, hey, we're here. Help
Hmm.
us, maybe.
Right. Hmm. That just reminded me that I had in my original trilogy, my main male characters believes that he's descended from the Alfar.
Yeah.
His father told him that, and his father's name was actually Alfar, I think. And there was like an ancient family story where one of the ancestors got stuck in a blizzard. He was out hunting, I think, and the storm was coming on, and he had killed a deer, I think it was, and he took the heart and he buried it at the base of this big tree. And I can't remember, it might have been an elm or whatever. And the storm hit, like it was a blizzard that just kind of came at, it really hit hard. And he decided there was no way he could try to get home. He'd just get lost in it. So he just sat at the base of this tree where he just put the heart, and the light elves came and saved.
Oh,
That was the family story. And then he disappeared for a while. And then when he came back, he was very different. And anyway, but I just now remembered, like, oh yeah, he had done that at a tree. He buried the heart at the tree. And he offered it to the Alfar. So they saved him.
yeah. And the worshiping was done in sacred groves.
Right.
That was true. I mean, they didn't necessarily worship indoors. It was mostly outdoors. And the
Mm.
same was true, um, with the Angles and Jutes and Saxons, the ones that,
And the Celts. Yeah.
and the Celts. Yeah. So outdoor worship and then cutting down
Mm.
the sacred groves was something that Christians did. They'd come in and axe them. One interesting story from Ireland is that, dairy it was that it comes from the word for oak.
Oh.
Um, and so it was a sacred place for the Druids. And then they built a monastery on it. And but there was a grove of oaks on that island. And Saint Colmcille, who was their like one of their most famous saints, said never cut those trees down.
Hmm.
Of course, they've been cut down now. I think maybe, I don't know if the English did it or not, but they
Mm.
might have. I don't know
Yeah.
who eventually cut them down, but there was a sacred grove of oaks on that island for probably centuries. I don't know, but
Mm.
they were very
Yeah.
famous in the early medieval period.
When I was mentioning that id list, sacred groves, stone circles, all those kinds of things are I just love that kind of stuff. I eat that
Oh
kind of stuff
yeah.
up.
And I Scotland, especially I was got so interested in Dunod and the Pictish era area,
Mm.
which we know so little about. We just have a few of their stone carvings. And then even before that, the ones who made these avenues of stones, standing stones, they're all over the place. They're in Brittany, uh they're in Ireland, Scotland, England. and of course Scandinavia. But
There's tons of stone circles and things in Sweden. Yeah.
yes, yes, there
Standing
are.
stones. Yeah. It's so cool. I'm just talking about this kind of stuff and I'm
I
like,
know.
ah, it's so much fun.
And some of those stone circles, especially in Ireland and in Scotland, are so ancient. They're
Mm,
prehistoric. I mean, they date back thousands of years, some of them, to the earliest people. It was so interesting. We went to Stonehenge this summer, but then we also went to a an exhibit at the Royal British Columbia Museum in Victoria, which is not too far from, we like to go up there on weekends. And that exhibit was amazing. And they had actually, figured out what the people who built Stonehenge, what they looked like. So
mm,
they were dark skinned, dark haired, and blue eyed. And so they had made, figurines or life size models of these people, and they
mm.
showed them in action, building Stonehenge. I mean,
Oh,
they
that's
had like
cool.
exhibits and then they would have like little TV monitors where the archaeologists would be talking about their discoveries, and
Hmm.
it was so interesting. But
Yeah.
and there were like three distinct phases of Stonehenge that were hundreds of years apart.
Hmm.
And they don't know why there were changes, but they moved the stones around. They kept them in the same location, but different formations of the stones. They were definitely
Hmm.
moved. So interesting. Of course, we don't know what any of it means, but at least
Right.
we know what happened. They figured out the sequence of the timings of these remodels and renovations of Stone.
The, re the Stonehenge remodel.
Mhm. But they also found out that there was a natural, I got to look this up because there was a natural directional land feature in Stonehenge, and they used that as their guide for the orientation of Stonehenge.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I don't know if I can find that. Maybe if I put in Stonehenge, I was just looking for a refresher. It was so interesting. And then we also went to Avebury. We took a tour.
Oh, nice.
It was a van tour, a small van tour. It was really fun. And we were staying in Bath after the conference, and then we took a tour that took us to the Cotswolds. It took us to Stonehenge and Avebury. And it was really fun because the guide was very experienced. It was a small group. We really learned a lot on that.
Hmm.
But we learned even more at this exhibit in
The
British
exhibit.
Columbia. So it was very
That's really
fun.
cool.
Yes.
Well, I didn't do any kind of Viking thing, but when I went to Japan this summer, that was when I found like these ancient, well, I don't know how ancient they were, but going into the forests in like some of the smaller towns in Japan and seeing some of the temples and the shrines, and I saw the ruins of a samurai castle, and it
Oh my
was just the
gosh.
samurai castle was really cool because it was just there were just three of us who had gone to that. We were staying in this place called Shingu, and nobody else who was with us wanted to go. There were like three of us were like, I was like, yeah, I want to go see this. The ruins of the samurai castle, and it was getting to be sundown. So it was starting to get a little spooky. And oh my goodness, and then we got separated. I got excited and I ran up some stairs and I'm looking around and I'm like, oh, my friends are gone. Like, I thought, did I walk? Of course, being a writer, I'm thinking, did I walk into another world? Am I like in another dimension and my friends are gone? So I'm on around. I was actually kind of relieved when I saw them. But yeah,
Oh God.
it was super cool. But it had that same, it wasn't ancient or anything, but just when you go to those places that are old, you can, if you're open to it, you can feel it. And if there's not a million
Mhm.
tourists there,
Yeah, yeah.
you can
You can feel the history.
feel
Yeah.
the history. It was very fun.
I think
And
when we went to Stonehenge, we could feel a sense of awe, I guess is
yeah,
what I would
sure.
say.
Hmm.
Nothing specific, but just a sense of awe.
Hmm. That's
And
really
it's
neat.
amazing. It is really fun to go to those places.
And then one of the people I was traveling with, he said, he was like, "Oh, you should write a story about a Viking who ends up in Japan." And of course, I'm like, that would be fun. But then I was looking at it, I thought, well, maybe somebody could have gotten like just off course.
Oh my God, it'd be pretty tough.
But then I looked at my map. When I got home, I looked at a map and I was like, Japan is really, really far
Yeah,
from anything we know about where the Vikings were. Even if they made it to like India or something, Japan is still a long ways away.
exactly.
So I don't know. I was like, how could I in those long ships, like how long would one of those last? Would it last for years to get you all the way across to, I don't know. I
It
was like,
probably would because they did treat the hulls with tar.
yeah, they could stop places, I guess, and work on
Mhm.
it, but it just
But
seemed a little
it's
too
far-fetched.
wild.
And
It'd have to be
it's like
complete.
Shogun. That's what Shogun is about,
Right,
really.
yeah.
I mean, an Englishman much later, but and did you
Yeah.
see the new Shogun? Have you seen?
Yes, I
I have
really
not seen it
liked
yet. I
it.
really want to see it.
It's very well done.
That's what I've heard. Yeah,
So, yeah.
I definitely want. That's on my list.
So, yeah, I put that whole idea of a Viking ending up in Japan out of my head.
It would be kind of interesting to write about a Viking following the Silk Road all the way to China, though,
Yeah.
because that is I mean, it's not something that there's any historical fact of, because really the Volga is about as far as they got, far east as they got. But, it's not impossible that a stray Viking
Yeah.
did
Oh,
that
sure.
trip, especially after the Varangian Guard, when that time period, when they were established in Constantinople, they might have wandered off, but that would have been later than what I'm writing about and you're writing about. But it could have
Yeah.
happened. Could have happened.
Yeah. And
So,
then when in Kat Jarman's book, The River Kings, and she
mhm.
traces that, was it a carnelian bead? Or
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
and
it
she,
was
what was it in
carnelian.
northern England? And then she followed it like where and all the way to India, wasn't it?
Yep,
And I was thinking,
amazing.
oh, that would be a fun, like, who were these people who maybe traded it along the way? How, to trace this one bead all the way to
Those kind
northern
of things are
England.
so inspiring.
Yeah. And then that's another thing we were talking about things changing and learning new things. It just seems like in the past just few years, like 3 years maybe, where people are starting to really focus on and understand just how far east the Vikings went, how much that
Yeah,
that route down through Russia, Ukraine, and through the Baltic and all of, or yeah, and all that way, how big of a thing it was.
yeah. Well, in my first book, I wrote about, Olaf is kidnapped and he does travel to Bulgar, which was on the Volga. And it was, the original, one of the original settlements of the Bulgar people. But it was a trading post. It was a huge trading city. And it was about halfway down the Volga because the Volga keeps going down to the Caspian Sea, to a place that was known as Itil, Itil. And that's when I stopped. I said, okay,
Mhm.
I wanted to have him go all the way to Baghdad, but it's like, no, no, that's a whole book itself. So I did cut that part and just had him go as far as Bulgar. But that was pretty distant. And at that time period, early 800s, it was terra incognita. I mean,
Hmm.
nobody had been there, and really, but there was, a thriving culture in the middle, in the east, and then also in the west, but that was the beginning of burqa too, because burqa,
Hmm.
it's interesting to me, is burqa and Baghdad and some of these other places were all established around the year 750. They were all these trading ports kind of came to be around in the last part of the 8th century. So by the early ninth, they were going great guns.
Hmm.
But it was still a very exploratory and pioneering kind of a life to be a trader that went that far.
Hmm.
So interesting
Hmm.
and very hard to find any information. Everything seems to start around, all the history seems to start around like 840. So I
Hmm.
was writing before that. I was writing like in the before 820, and there's just nothing.
Hmm. When was Kiev established?
I believe that was in the 800s. So,
Yeah, that too, because it grew to
but
be a
it's a
big
little bit later.
trading place too.
Hmm. It
Hmm.
was.
Yeah, my Helgi the Marked book, he's around Kiev. He travels down to Constantinople from Denmark. So did you have any challenges or triumphs this year?
Oh, I think it's always a challenge and a triumph just to finish a book and get it out there.
Yes, agreed.
I I think revisions are always a challenge, and trying to get the story together and the book together. To me, that's my challenge. So, how about
Mm-hmm.
you?
Yeah, late last year and early, like first half of this year, I struggled. I was trying to write the third book in my Helgi the Marked series, and I I thought I kind of wrapped it up after the second book, but I had some people say, "Well, what happened to him between this point and this point?" And I was like,
Mm.
I don't know. So I kept trying to come up with something, and I it just wasn't working. It was like I was forcing. I had one iteration where I came up with this interesting side character, and then but she was kind of taking over, and it was becoming more her story than his. So I thought, well, maybe she needs her own story. So I put that on the back burner, and then I came up with something else, and I was like, that's not quite right. And so it was like each iteration I'd start it, and then I'd go, this isn't him. This isn't where I want to go with this story. So I finally just I'm like, I'm just gonna put it aside and do something different. So, but I love this character, and I'd like to go back to him at some point, but I've just got to. It just wasn't clicking.
Yeah, it
So
just needs time.
yeah,
Time to simmer away on the back burner, like you said.
yeah.
Yeah,
So.
and I think I gave myself a little bit extra time this year. I made it my issue date, my release date's going to be March 30th. Well, a lot of times I do release early, which is fine, but I wanted to give myself enough time because last year I just felt pressured, and so I
Mm.
want to just give myself extra time this year, and I think that's going to work out well. I think sometimes that's what you really need is you need the time
Hmm.
to let the ideas cook away because they're not quite ready yet, like you
Or
said.
maybe those two books are it. Maybe that's
It's
all I've
possible.
got. And I need to move on. So
Mhm.
yeah, the early this year, I really just didn't, I was just floundering until I found the story that I just finished. So like the last half of the year was great because I was writing. It was like that meme, where the little cats just like
Yeah,
writing like crazy. That's how I was the second half of this year.
that's wonderful.
So yeah.
Uh, yeah, I'm not like that very often because I spend most of my time in my imagination and then I'll write that down. But it never turns out to be all that much. So
Mm.
it's like I have to do a lot of mental traveling.
Yeah, yeah. I do that a lot, like at night after, like, my husband and
Mm.
I will watch something on TV, and then I just kind of sometimes I'll just sit quietly and just not read or watch anything or listen to anything. I just kind of sit there. And then often in the morning, especially in the winter when it's dark in the morning, it actually gets dark here, even though
I
it's
was just gonna say, does it?
so I'll just lay in bed for like 20 minutes and I just let my mind kind of wander. If I'm working on something specific, I might let my mind think about that story. And so often when I sit down to write, it's my mind is primed and
Mhm.
and more things come out, but not always.
And that's the good thing about writing about approximately the same time every day, too.
Hmm.
It really does help because it then your mind is ready, your body's ready, you're just,
Hmm.
and your ideas can come that more easily then.
Yeah, I think so. I
Yeah.
did have one neat win when I had that short story published
Yes.
in the Odin anthology by Flame Tree Publishing. So that was really fun. That was a good thing that happened at the beginning of the year. A friend of mine had
Fantastic.
just told me about this short story that they were looking for submissions. And I was like, oh no, the deadline's in 2 weeks. And I thought, well, what have I got to lose? I'm not making any traction on my novel, so I might as well write this. And yeah, it was really fun. And I love the book and it is a gorgeous
Their books
cover.
are
I
gorgeous.
know, they're so good. So yeah, that was my biggest win. Well,
That's
other than finishing
fantastic.
that book. So finishing
Yeah.
that book, that first draft, and then getting the short story published, those were a couple of my wins.
Sounds like you had a very good year.
Yeah. Oh, have you found any new like resources for research or anything?
Yeah, there was one that really excited me, and that was a great new book called The North Women
Oh
by
yeah.
Heather Pringle, and she's a journalist. But that book, I thought, oh my gosh, another rehash of all the stuff that I already know about Viking Age women. Well, when I got it, I realized she had done some digging, and she was coming at it from a different point of view than most because she's a journalist and she's
Mm,
not steeped in Viking lore. It was definitely a different point of view about all these things. So it was a great book, and I was really happy that I got it. I got it for my birthday because that's what I
oh,
ask
nice.
research books for my birthday a lot. Then I don't feel so guilty about buying more books. But I do have a pretty big library, and I love it. I love my books, and I do use them all the time. I mean, I do research online, but I really like my research books, and they all have
Hmm.
the little post-it flags bristling out of the top of
I
them,
know, mine too.
pages. Yeah.
Sometimes I have to go in and go, okay, I've already done the research on that. I can take that little tag off.
Oh, I never do because I don't remember or I'll forget about it.
Oh, yeah.
That's what has been really great about some of our podcasts is it's forced me to go back.
Hmm.
I'll know something, but I don't remember the source and I don't remember all the details. And so that
Hmm.
makes me go back to my sources and find those things again. Because I have papers from academia.edu, and
Hmm.
that's a great resource as well. And so I just have hundreds of papers that I've read and gotten ideas from. And so I don't always know which source it came from.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm the same. Oh, speaking of Academia EDU, now I can't remember her name. She studied the fortress on Birka. Oh, it was I read a couple
Oh,
of her papers. They were so
yes.
fascinating. So I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, but yeah, it was really interesting stuff. And of course, now I'm like, I need to write a story that takes place there. So,
That was such a fascinating place. And oh my gosh, that the the idea that when it was destroyed, when that fortress at Birka was destroyed, there were like hundreds and hundreds of arrowheads they found.
hmm.
So the whole place was just completely attacked with fire arrows by, this huge archery army, and nobody knows exactly what happened there, what but they know it was attacked in the 900s and that the fortress was completely destroyed and
Hmm.
burned. And then they found all these arrowheads.
Hmm.
It's hundreds of them. So you kind of know what happens, but you don't know who did it. You don't know why they did it. That's such an interesting place.
Yeah, and that the fortress was I mean, these were just like actual soldiers who
Hmm.
that's what they were there for. They were there. I don't think there were hardly any women there. It was mostly just the soldiers, or at least not
Well,
like,
we don't know if they were men or women
yeah.
because, as we know, just
Right,
because
that's
they
true.
had weapons doesn't mean
Good
they were
point.
men. They could have been women warriors
There
too,
were
but
there were
there were
soldiers
no
there. No,
civilians.
you're right. That's what I was kind of meaning. Like
Because
they were not like
there was a
wives
town
and
of
stuff. And,
Burka that was next to
mhm.
this fortress.
Mhm.
But and there were lots of women in the town,
Right.
women and children, because they
Yeah.
found a lot of female graves. And they also found out that the women were traders there. Oftentimes they were, the ones who were the traders in various kinds of wares.
Hmm.
So that whole thing it's so interesting. So did those women go on voyages to get their goods, or did they just stay in Burqa and have their shops, how did they live? It's
Right.
so
Yeah.
interesting.
That was another place that I was when I went there, I was like, oh, this is neat.
Yeah, I have not been there, and I really would like to go. Maybe someday I'll get there.
Yeah, yeah. But that fortress was so interesting, and that so much of
Mhm.
the stuff that they had was kind of from the Rus, from the East. The way they dressed, the some of the arrows that they had were the bows. The bows were
Yeah.
different. Hmm.
So, and there's some, it seems like there was some Scythian influence there, from the nomadic tribes that were pretty prevalent
Hmm.
in the Rus area, the
Yeah.
Magyars and the Bulgars
Hmm.
and the Hungarians too.
Hmm.
The time that I'm writing about the early 800s, I guess the Hungarians were the nomadic tribes that came through that area, the Dnieper and those places. It wasn't the Peshkene. I'm not pronouncing it right.
Hessian eggs.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
the way you say it. It wasn't them. They weren't there yet. It was more likely to be the Hungarians coming through. But they were
Mm.
all these nomadic
Hmm.
horse tribes.
Hmm.
And the Bulgarians were as well. And they were farther to the east, but they moved west or yeah, they all moved, all these tribes moved west. They swept across
Hmm.
steppes and such an interesting time.
Well, and then in one more a research somebody I found this year, she has a YouTube channel. It's called Shield of Skuld,
Oh,
and she's a historian with a PhD in history and Viking studies. So yeah, I like her videos a lot. Sometimes she has just videos where she's talking about a particular thing she's had. She posts videos sometimes of talks that she's given, panels that she's done. So yeah, it's I like her channel a lot.
So, as I mentioned, I did go to the Historical Novel Society conference in the UK, and I was so excited to go back to the UK. And this conference was held at a place called Dartington Hall in Devonshire, which is south central England. And as I mentioned, the keynote speakers were Diana Gabaldon, Bernard Cornwell, Kate Quinn, and S.G. McLean, who
Mm.
she wrote the Bookseller of Inverness, and that's a recent title that's been really, really popular. I've read that one twice, but she wrote another series called the Seeker series that was,
I loved the Seeker
I
series.
loved it too, set in the Cromwellian era. And so I've read, I haven't read her earlier. She had an earlier series that I have not read, but I've read
Mm.
The Seeker, and then the Bookseller of Inverness was marvelous. So she was there as well, and Alison Morton. And I got to see Patricia Bracewell, who we interviewed earlier. I got to see her. But Dartington Hall is an interesting place because if you
Mm.
remember back, had our podcast on Saxon women, and so Dartington Hall was originally a homestead by the River Dart, which goes
Mm.
through that part of England, and it goes to Dartmouth. And you can actually take a boat on a cruise on the River Dart. But it's first mentioned in the registers of Shaftesbury Abbey in 833 when the Saxon lady Bargwin handed over her lands at Shaftesbury and accepted an offer from King Egbert of Wessex of lands at Dartingtonham. So the earliest known ownership of this estate was a Saxon woman,
Nice.
not her husband. This is before the Norman conquest. And so it's 833, which is exactly the time I'm writing about, or just,
Mm. Hmm.
the Oseberg burial ship is dated to 834.
Oh,
It's
okay.
so interesting. Anyway, we don't know anything else about the early history of it. The next thing we hear is when it was owned by a Norman knight much later, like in the 1100s. But I thought that was so interesting because we had done so much
Yeah.
into these Saxon women and the fact that they did own land. They were landowners in their own right during
Hmm.
that time period before the
Yeah,
Norman
that's neat.
conquest. Yeah. So yeah, anyway, I really did enjoy the Seeker series. And she has, like I said, there's an earlier series that I did not, S.G. McLean has that I did not get to read yet, but I probably will seek it out.
Yeah, sometimes I like to read historical fiction that's in a time period that I know nothing about.
Yeah.
So then I can just be a regular reader and turn off my brain and just go, okay,
Take
I'll
off your
trust
researcher
you.
hat.
Yeah, I'll just have fun in this other time period. I don't know anything about the Protectorate or all. I didn't know anything about. I just
I
knew
didn't
it. I just knew
either.
it. It had happened. I didn't know anything about it, and so it was fun to have a little romp in another time period. I thought it was really well done.
It was. And I thought the bookseller of Inverness was even better because the characters were just, I mean, I loved Seeker. He was great.
Hmm.
Uh, but in the bookseller of Inverness, I loved the old ladies. Oh my gosh. So these are the widows from, from the rebellion from
Mm,
Culloden. And they're all in their 60s and they are still hanging out with each other. And they're very rebellious, even though their town is occupied by British soldiers. These women are just they're dyed in the wool rebels,
yeah.
even at their advanced age, which we don't think of it as advanced
Right, not
anymore. I
now.
think one of them was 70 and she was ancient, so
That's pretty old for,
it was for that time. You
yeah,
bet.
was that 1600s, 1700s? No, wait, that's later. Culloden was
1700.
1700s. Yeah.
Yep, yep, it was.
Nice. So what's new for you for 20? Well, I know you have the Irish Harper coming out.
Yep.
Anything else happening in
Um,
2025?
No, I'm really just looking at getting that book and then starting getting that book published and then working on the next one. Because, like I said, I'm already thinking about at the end of the Irish Harper, something happens that is going to lead to the next book. And so,
Mm,
and when I was writing the Irish Harper, I thought about wrapping that up
mm.
and I just could not do it. It's like, no, it needs its whole book of its.
Yeah.
So it's gonna. The next book is already percolating.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but uh, it's going to be interesting.
Good. Yeah.
Yes. And so we've got some interesting upcoming podcast guests,
Yes.
including Nancy Marie Brown, who's one
Hmm.
of our both of our favorites authors of nonfiction books.
Yeah,
And
that'll be in February.
yep, yep. And we're also going to have a Finnish artist and folklorist named Nina Niskanen. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but um, she specializes in Finno-Baltic myths and folklore. She's an online educator and she's written the mythology of the Sami, and that's probably what we'll be talking to her mostly
Hmm.
about when we're going to interview her in January, and then her podcast will be in February, right?
March.
March. Sorry, I keep losing. It's so far in the distance.
I know it's getting ahead. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that'll be exciting because I really don't know that much about the Sami and
No, they're
just
very
cursory
mysterious.
stuff. Yeah. Hmm.
I
So
know they
that'll be
were
really
very,
interesting.
very mystical, and
Hmm.
there's if you remember in many of the sagas, they're the ones who really knew the magic and they
Hmm.
taught their magic to, well, Gunhild.
Gunhild. Yeah.
Yep. That's where she supposedly learned her magic. She supposedly lived with some magicians, some sorcerers for a time period. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. It could just be a smear on her name. But on the other hand, it's quite fascinating to.
That's her. There's two origin stories for her.
Yes.
That one's much more interesting.
It is. It is. And the other one is that she was a princess, basically.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I love that one. And so much of the cultures, the Viking culture and the Sami culture, they meshed so much, and there's so
Mhm.
much crossover, and yet they definitely have distinct identities.
Yeah. When I went to, I forget which museum it was in Stockholm, they had a lot of clothing and like some of the hats and the boots and things and artifacts from the Sami culture. It was really kind of neat. Very colorful and beautiful, lots of
They
red
are
and blue and
beautiful.
hmm
And the fact that they cross over all of the Nordic countries of
Mm-hmm.
Scandinavia or of Europe, Russia, Finland, Sweden, and Norway are all have Sami
Mm-hmm.
areas.
That's true.
Yeah.
And I know J.R.R. Tolkien was inspired by their folklore
Oh,
for his elves and things, and the Elvish language, I think, was partly inspired by the Finnish language too, I think.
it could be. It could
Could
be
be.
because yeah, and I'm trying to remember back, that he had a book called The Silmarillion, which was
Hmm.
like all of his backstories and notes
Yeah,
and everything. And
it's a
I don't,
slog. I
yeah, I
love
don't have it
Tolkien, but
anymore,
it's hard.
but it's got some of those, and that's, you can find the origins. Yeah, it's very hard to read.
Hmm.
It's not like reading The Lord of the
It's
Rings.
like reading a history book.
Well, a good history book is even better than that.
Well, not in that time
You
period
mean
when
an
he
acad?
was
Oh,
right.
yeah, right.
Yeah, like when he
Academic
was
history,
writing
but
that in the 30s and 40s, I'm sure history textbooks were not, or books were not like they are now. They're not, they're much more better at storytelling. But some of the stories of the elves in that were really cool. But
they were.
it has like, in the beginning was the song, that's like it all started with music and like this god and that god. I mean, it's interesting, but it's pretty dry stuff. You
Yeah,
have to really be
yeah,
a Tolkien fan to follow
yeah.
that.
Yes, I know. I remember getting it, and I was still, I think I was still in high school when I got that. High school or early college, maybe, and I was so disappointed in it because I,
Mm.
at that age, I just couldn't slog through it. I probably could now,
Yeah,
and
I
I don't
tried to
have
read
it
it
anymore.
once. Yeah, I tried to read it once and I was like, this is boring. And then
Yeah.
I did finally read through it. And then but when he got to the stories, and I forget what they were about, like the Silmarils and the evil Morgoth and like the elves who were fighting, and these elves came from here, and like that was fun. That was kind of
Yes.
cool stuff.
Yes.
But some of it was but it wasn't as much of a good story as The Lord
And
of the
I
Rings.
don't really think he intended for it to
He
be
didn't.
published. It was his own private information, or as far as I understand, his reference materials, as
Yeah.
far as I gathered,
I think he wanted to publish it, but I'm not sure. Maybe he would have worked
revised
on
it.
it more. Maybe I don't know. But anyway, yeah, that'll be fun to learn about the Sami.
Well, speaking of elves, I wanted to read a little passage from my new book because if you remember in the Queen of War, Ulf, the blacksmith, introduces Halfdan to the Landvetter, which are the
Mm,
spirits of the land. They're the ones that live in the rocks, and they're very commonly spoken of in the Icelandic sagas. And in fact, Nancy
hmm
Marie Brown has written a book called Searching for the Hidden Folk, which is
mm,
about them. And the Irish believe in them as well, that they live in the rocks and the trees. Well, I realized, Halfdan was making friends with these people. So I wanted to write a scene about what it was like for him to go visit them and play with them. So there's just a short passage about it. And the boys' lessons, Ronval's is Sonia and Olaf's 3-year-old son. His foster came and collected the younger boy for his nap, and Halfdan was free to wander. After his last escapade, he knew his boundaries and had promised not to venture beyond them. So he stopped at the kitchen and grabbed some bread and cheese for his lunch, as well as a leather bottle of small beer, which of course is watered down beer. Um, Trailed by the blind wolf, he entered the forest in search of the Landvetter, who were his friends. He approached the waterfall that flowed from a rocky outcropping. In the springtime, the water cascaded briskly, but this late in the summer, it had dried to a trickle. Still, it was cool here, and the moss was soft. Thilgia lapped the water from a pool and then flopped down in the shade, panting a little. Behind the waterfall yawned the black mouth of the cave where the spirits dwelled. Halfdan found the rock with the shallow depression carved in the surface, an ancient elf cup. He took the skin of beer from around his neck and poured a little in the declivity. Let them come who wish to come, let them go who wish to go, and do no harm to me or mine, he chanted, as Ulf had taught him. Thilgia whined, faintly, and the hair on Halfdan's arms prickled. A cool breeze sprang up and caressed his cheek. It was the vetter's invitation. Halfdan took off his boots and walked barefoot beneath the curtain of water that spilled over the rocks. The moss was soft and cold on his bare feet, and the air smelled fresh. Behind the waterfall, the shadowy cave beckoned. Halfdan stepped onto the slippery rocks and entered the space behind the flowing water. The air was chilled and thick with moisture. He called out to his friends, the spirits of the falls. They greeted him and invited him to enter their world. The blind wolf curled up outside and fell asleep while Halfdan walked into the cave. The vetters surrounded Halfdan with delight. They were little creatures no bigger than Ronvald, although they were plumper. They wore tunics woven of cobwebs and red toadstools for hats. The vetter brought out their instruments and struck up an unearthly music. One strummed a harp with strings of running water. One played drums with the sound of thunder, while another sang with the voice of the wind. An isolated thunderstorm appeared above the holy hill for those with eyes to see. So that's the whole.
Oh, I loved
But I just thought it was so
that.
fun because I've always, ever since I first had him introduced, I wanted to know what did they do. So
Yeah.
it came to me.
Nice. Did you just make that all up, or was like with like the toadstool as his
I
hat
just
and
made it up.
I love all of it, and the plucking the strings of water and the drum of thunder. Lovely. I like that.
It was very fun to write.
And I think that's a great place to call it a day. Nice way to
Absolutely.
wrap everything up.
Sounds good to me.
Well, this was a good chat.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. Lots of interesting things we've been doing.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's nice. All
Okay.
right. Well, it was good talking to you.
Good talking to
All right.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. You can find Johanna at johannawittenberg.com, where you'll find a free short story, a prequel to her Norse Queen series. And you can find me, KS, at ksbarton.com, where you can also find a free short story from me, a prequel to my Norse family series. See you next time.